Би жаргал сайхан байна. Та юу чадхаа, юу байгаагаараа, хаа байгаа газараа хичээнгүйлэн хий. Theodore Roosevelt. Сайн байцгаана хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр ороо манай facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор
Rana Flowers Нэгдсэн үндэсний байгууллагын хүүхдийн сангийн суурин төлөөлөгч. Тэрбэр өмнө нь Төв Америк дэх Белиз улсад Нэгдсэн үндэсний байгууллагын хүүхдийн сангийн суурин төлөөлөгчөөр 2005-аас 2009 оны хугацаанд ажиллажээ. Хадагтай Flowers Нэгдсэн үндэсний байгууллагын хүүхдийн санд анх 1994 онд зөвлөхөөр ажиллаж эхэлснээс хойш тус байгууллагын Нью-Йорк хот дахь төлөвлөлт үнэлгээний болон мэдээлэл харилцааны хилцүүд мөн Латин Америк, Карибын бүсийн төвд тус ажиллаж байжээ. Үүнээс өмнө буюу 80-аад оны эхээр хадагтай Flowers Их Британи болон Австралийн эрүүл мэндийн яамтай хамтран хөгжлийн бэрхшээлтэй болон хүчирхийлэл, зүй бус харьцаанд өртсөн хүүхэд өсвөр үеийнхэнд олон нийтийн халамж дэмжлэг үзүүлэх үйл ажиллагааг явуулж байжээ. Тэрээр Австралийн иргэн бөгөөд бизнесийн удирдлагын магистр, нийгмийн ухаан урлагийн чиглэлээр бакалаврын зэрэгтэй.
Good evening, Rana.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming to this program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about your mission here in Mongolia.
Sure.
What are you doing?
Well, I'm here with UNICEF. I've been here about almost 2 years now. And here in Mongolia, UNICEF is very much focused, as it is in all countries, on the situation, the rights of children up to the age of 18. So really in place to support the government, to, I hope, provoke and ensure that we achieve progressive implementation of children's rights.
So how is it done?
How's it done? Well, it's done by really understanding what the evidence is on the situation of children, really knowing the data, making sure that we have that disaggregated, that we can tell you exactly where children are dying in greater number, where children are being excluded from school, where we see that we have problems with nutrition. So all of that is part of our role to really try and help improve the data system.
So let's approach it in the way from very small baby to the problems to the children are under 18 years old. We have been experiencing, unfortunately, one of the highest maternity risk mortality of children. Please give us some statistics and tell us if it is getting better or worse.
Yeah, well, I think actually it's one of the areas that has improved, and improved quite a lot here in Mongolia. I think over the last 10 years we've seen the child mortality decrease by more than a third. That's the under 5-year-olds.
Okay.
And in that figure we need to look at the infant mortality, and most of that happens in the first month of life. So we can pinpoint what's causing the mortality and some of the actions that we can take to
tell us
address
what is
that.
the reason of the infant mortality
Well,
under 1 month.
The primary causes of infant mortality, for example, are asphyxiation at birth. It's respiratory problems in the newborn. It's infection rates in newborns. So all of which we can take steps to further improve.
You said
those
there are
statistics.
respiratory problems. Why is that? What is that?
Well, it can be caused by any number of reasons. It's newborns with weaker lungs, so perhaps premature babies. It's factors of nutrition and not having strong systems. We can certainly see that in older children in particular we're seeing an increase in pneumonia and other respiratory problems, with pollution being a contributing factor to that. We can point to problems in heating in some of the health centres. Yeah, in about 65% of health centres that we studied, and we studied about 21 of them in detail, we found that in fact the heating was considerably below what it needed to be for
Why is that?
infant births. It's a factor of not having reliable electricity, not having boilers that are sufficiently strong enough to heat the whole centre. It's fuel problems as the winter goes on. It can be all of those factors, which for me is quite an exciting area, because I really would like to see us move into alternate energy sources there and really think about how we might use solar power more effectively, or wind power in some cases, in some of these rural centres.
Well, please compare it to other countries, our neighbor countries, the children mortality, infant mortality.
In terms of infant and under 5 mortality, Mongolia is doing very well and has in fact been able to lower its levels. Certainly is on track to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, which is not the case in many other countries in the region. To get down to a developed country level, you're looking at maybe an infant mortality rate of around 5, 6 per 1,000 births. And here in Mongolia, currently it's around about 19.
19 per 1,000.
Per 1,000. So that's not a bad achievement, actually. That's very good, and I think
What
we
is
need
done,
to acknowledge that.
What has done that substantial things which decreased that much, 1/3?
Well, for the under 5 mortality, which has also decreased, as well as maternal mortalities, there's been a good reduction in that. A contributing factor has been that we have cost-effective interventions that we've been able to reach the children with. There are a lot more information today about the kinds of protocols that the doctors and the nurses can follow that will ensure that they've checked off various issues and made sure that the children and the babies aren't suffering from those. And of course, we have better medications and we have vaccination, which has made an enormous difference in terms of the under 5 mortality rates.
Vaccination. Is it also because the birth rate in the country keep going down?
There isn't a consistent birth rate. For example, last year we saw an increase in the birth rate. This year we're seeing a decrease again. So no, it's also rated per number of births. So the actual rate isn't affected by the numbers.
Okay, there is not any abnormal trend.
No. There's a downward trend, but we're yet to stabilize a very good downward trend.
That's very good news for Mongolians to hear, because we have been receiving always very negative news about infant mortality. And I mean, you know, when it comes to family, this is very painful.
Absolutely.
And I have gone through it, and then it is something that you don't know what to do.
No. I think we still need very much to look at what we would say is the disparity. So, you know, in some areas we still see higher levels of infant mortality, and that's an indicator for us that we need to be focusing. For the Ministry of Health, that's where they need to focus the resources.
Okay, let's keep growing. Let's talk about the school children, their rights. Now because the 1/3 of the population is living under poverty line in this country, keep not decreasing. In that circumstances, not everybody has a food the required level, calorie a day, and the government had decided to give a food, etc., to school children. What do you think about the malnutrition in Mongolia of children?
Yeah, Mongolia's had quite a high chronic malnutrition figure. It's has been in the last decade at 29%. It has come down a little in that period, and the most recent household survey that we've been able to conduct with the government indicates it's also come down again. So that's the good news. It has reduced. I think
what is 29% malnutrition? Please tell, what does that mean?
Chronic malnutrition is not malnutrition in terms of wasting. Wasting is where you really don't have enough food and the body wastes away. Whereas chronic malnutrition is a condition of not having enough variety. Of food. Okay. So, you know, a diet that consists of primarily and mostly meat is not sufficient for a growing child. And what you find is that the child their height does not go up at the rate it should for their age. So you often will look at a child and think, oh, that child's 9, for example, and they're really 13.
So almost 1/3 of our children have that chronic malnutrition?
1/3 of the children in Mongolia had chronic malnutrition. We think the figure has now come down.
What is in the developed countries?
In chronic malnutrition, it's very low.
Very low? Very
low, yeah. I think in developed countries, probably the greater concern now, and it's also a growing concern here in Mongolia, is obesity.
Yes, Well, some is suffering because too much eating, the other is too little eating, no?
Yeah, well, chronic malnutrition, you can eat a lot.
Yes.
But if you don't have that variety, and I think it's really a behaviour change, it's really information for parents,
Yes.
it's really try and introduce, you have to have your flours, you have to have your meats, and you have to have some vegetables.
So, this is the composition of these three different types
and
of
fruits,
foods.
and just try and mix up the variety as much as you possibly can that you can get access to, so that your children can have that nutritional balance.
So children who keep eating just meat would be in this category?
Children who just eat meat could be in this category, yes.
Well, maybe it is also 1/3, it has to do with the 1/3 of poverty.
Yeah, our statistic on child poverty has been around 42%, so it's really a very high level of child poverty that's obviously an enormous concern for the government, and it's an enormous concern which we are trying to assist them to address. And therein, you can see chronic malnutrition as a factor, obviously access to services becomes a factor. And, I think the other area, we think about chronic malnutrition and we think about health. And it absolutely makes children and women more vulnerable to disease. It makes them more vulnerable to death. But it also affects the learning capacity of children.
Yes.
If children aren't getting the nutrition they need, they can't concentrate in the class, and therefore they won't achieve the academic levels that they could have were they to have good nutrition. So there are lots of reasons to focus on nutrition, to really promote primary health care, so that we're really emphasising the importance of nutrition.
Well, that's a big concern if children have not enough food or variety of food. In terms of the school program about giving food, and we talk about the quality of food, giving a junk food, all whatever cakes, etc. What would you tack on that?
I think that's a problem across the world, and I don't think I've seen any education system really master a very good school feeding program. Although I've seen many in smaller attempts
in this
really
country?
try. I think there's an attempt to improve it, but we have a long way to go to improve the nutritional balance of school feeding.
And some say that why we have to give all these foods to everybody. Instead, maybe we can give to those who really need, maybe better quality, better variety of food.
Yeah, I think that the targeted versus the universal argument is a classic one that we can go on for some time about. My own belief is that if you're going to feed children, then feed them all, because at home we don't have information on what the families are feeding, and in the end, we're about the development of children, and we want all children in Mongolia to develop, and we want them all to have the same opportunities. And that means give them all a good meal so that they can all achieve at school as much as possible.
Let's talk about child labor, a violation of the children's right.
Right.
What is the situation of these issues in Mongolia?
Yeah, in Mongolia, the predictions in terms of child labour are around about 15% of children. And that's in the age group of 5 to 15 involved in child labour. Now, for UNICEF, that's a very strictly applied definition. We consider it child labour when it interferes with the child's education. And that can include if the child's working till quite late at night and then is too tired the next day to be able to stay awake in class.
So what you're saying is out of age 15, 5 to 15, up to 15% of Mongolian children are working. It's
primarily boys, and it's primarily in the agricultural sector.
Boys and agriculture. Is it not because nowadays we have, isn't it because now we have more women educated and then boys not educated compared to each other?
We do have a disparity in Mongolia that appears in the secondary schools in particular, where we're seeing more girls do better in school. And we see a trend where you'll see more boys not finishing secondary school. Ironically, that seems to be a trend in a number of the developed countries, where we're seeing women in much greater number enrolling in university and women doing much better in their academic studies. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that we're seeing across the globe.
Okay.
So.
Well, then the women will have more rights in all fields of all across our life.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out in terms of family relationships.
Okay.
There'll have to be a rebalancing somewhere in terms of how things get managed at home, how things get managed in the workplace. If women go to academic studies and then go on to get the employment they deserve because they have the higher qualifications, then you would hope that, men will also be able to change, and we'll see a changing in the roles.
If there is any new statistics on girls in higher education than boys?
In Mongolia, I don't have the exact figure. I know it's more girls than boys. I know, for example, that in the States now, for every 3 students that goes to university, 2 of them will be women.
Oh, it's already quite large.
Very large.
70%.
I know that in some of the universities, for example, the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean, 82% of the first-year students were women. 82%. So it's a really very interesting phenomenon that we're seeing here. And we really need to understand it better and what the consequences are going to be.
Okay, let's take off a bit from Mongolia. Let's talk to your experience around the world. You have been working in London, Australia, then in New York, and Belize, former Honduras, right? What was the most exciting changes you have seen where you have been working in terms of children's, their rights, well-being, etc.?
Oh, great question. I think, well, my work in Australia was with human rights, and I think the impact that the Convention on the Rights of the Child had, and the fact that children's issues went from being something you argue on the basis of need, along with every other need that you might identify, to being something that's a very solid legal right which the government has an obligation to meet. And that caused an enormous sea change in terms of how policies were developed, the ways that children's issues were addressed. And I think that was very inspiring moment for me. I think the time in Belize, which is, as you said, the old British Honduras there, it's a large indigenous population living in very traditional ways. I see similarities here in Mongolia in terms of access to water and sanitation and nutrition. There were some of the very similar challenges that we saw there. But very interesting to work with the communities there and for themselves to start identifying how they would go back to their traditional vegetables, how they would, they started to develop different ways of using the foods so that they could start addressing the nutrition issue. So it wasn't something that was imposed, but really something they developed from the ground up and decided themselves how they were going to move forward.
You are from Australia, are you?
Yeah.
Okay. How you have decided in your life to be working for children? When, at which moment of your life you have decided? Who impact on that?
Yeah, I think, well, it's probably a couple of major impacts. I think probably my parents were extremely instrumental. My father, in terms of social justice, and a message that rings in my head always is from him that if you have a voice, then you must use it, and you must use it for the you must use it for the disadvantaged, and we need to judge our societies by how we treat our children and our most vulnerable, and if we do that, then we'll start to get the mixture right. So that was his influence. Whereas my mother was a very strong environmentalist and an advocate for communities and for building communities and their power to really take on some of the big industries. I grew up in a very industrialised city, coal mining, Newcastle.
Newcastle, okay.
North of Sydney. And very, very clear, very hard-working, strong work ethic. And so those were the influences at that time. And then I think just moving into human rights and then really having a passion for children's rights.
Wow.
And a sense that we really have to make a difference in this.
How many siblings do you have?
I have 2. I have an older brother and a younger sister.
Older brother, you are in between?
I'm the dreadful middle child, yes.
Okay. So you studied in Australia and then you went to England?
I did. I worked for a few years in England.
What you were doing?
I was doing some community development work there, as well as work with the Ministry of Health.
Yes.
Looking at child health issues.
Okay.
And children's
so
issues
the situation
there, disabled
England,
children.
Oh, the situation in England is better than in Australia?
Different
Okay.
than in Australia.
Very diplomatic. Okay.
Very different.
UNICEF is diplomats. Yes, I know.
Only, yeah,
Tell
I
me,
manage
please,
sometimes.
Can we talk a bit about disabled children?
Yeah.
And I mean, disabled people have themselves deserve a lot of attention of ordinary, not disabled people. Mm-hmm. Nothing to say about the children.
Yeah.
So how is the situation with disabled children in Mongolia?
Yeah. I think, obviously one of the focus that UNICEF's trying to bring here is very much on equity. Mm-hmm. Who is excluded? How do we, assist the government to ensure that they're reached? How do we make sure that they're included in all forms and to all services? And for us, disabled children is one of the groups that has been a neglected area. And it's very hard even to put a finger on how many children there are, where those children are, the degree to which they are excluded from education services, from accessing health services. We don't have very good early identification of disabled children. We don't have good occupational therapy or sufficient occupational therapy. I think if you live in the city, you're obviously much more fortunate, and I would say that for a number of areas. If you live in rural areas, then it's very neglected and probably
why they would
more
not
hushed.
compose those, why they would not obtain these statistics?
You can get statistics through the Ministry of Social Welfare and Labour in terms of the benefits that go to families for disabled children. But I think that one of the things we're trying to do this year, in fact, is a situation analysis of disabled children. So not just how many there are, but what are the circumstances of those children? Right. What kinds of disabilities do they have? What kinds of access barriers? What are the bottlenecks that they face in terms of access?
Because without proper attention from people, healthy people, towards those who is disabled, the society is getting very rough, very tough, cruel in a way.
Yeah. Every society is a tough society for someone who has, a physical disability or an intellectual disability that's not well understood. And, you only have to look at the streets to understand the challenges that the physically disabled must face. And in fact, only the other day in the street out the front here, I was watching a blind woman trying to cross the road and people not stopping to assist her. And I understand that the cars don't stop at pedestrian crossings here anyway, but just to see the struggle that this woman was having was, it just really brought home again the kinds of problems that the disabled have. And it really is a proactive. You really have to make your laws and make your policies so that they are extra advantageous to the disabled, because they suffer the double disability of not just having a disability, but also often living in poverty, often having a disease burden that's not addressed, and so forth.
Exactly. Let's have a little bit talk about the access to sanitation, particularly in Ulaanbaatar area.
Right.
Because this is, I believe, at the level of emergency almost.
Yeah.
Tell us about the situation.
Well, certainly I would characterise the situation of sanitation across Mongolia as a silent emergency. And it's not one, it's interesting, and I say silent on purpose because it's very hard to get people to talk about it. They'll talk about water and access to clean water and the struggle that is. And there's lots of efforts. There's, coordinating committee that's come together to try and address these issues. But sanitation really is the poor cousin still. And I think one of our goals, it has to be a cornerstone of where UNICEF moves in the next 5 years, in my view. It has to be an issue that is demand-driven. I'd really love every citizen to demand a toilet and demand the right to have a toilet, or at least an improved pit latrine. And by that we mean a pit latrine that is cemented. We have a lot of environmental degradation going on because of the fact that they're not sealed, and that when you have flooding, of course, that then contributes to river pollution and so forth. So we have hygiene problems that contribute to an enormous disease burden in this country, and again to educational achievement, because you contribute to disease in the children. It's just one of those issues that I'm hoping to get people excited about. I'm looking for poster people, so I hope you might join us and become an advocate for toilets. I think it has an economic cost, and we're doing a study this year to try and assess what the economic costs of not having improved sanitation are. And as I said, they won't just be health. You have a tourism impact. You have access, in your health centres. You have, in your dormitories, you need to go into the rural centres and walk into these buildings and look for the tap and look for the bathroom. And they're honestly horrendous. They really are embarrassing, in my view. And it's an intolerable situation. We really should be demanding a much higher level of sanitation and hygiene in a country with this level of development.
It's exactly these issues, and I'm so glad that you are addressing it. And without a solution of these problems, access to sanitations, we will not solve many social problems. It's a water issue, access to water, and it is having normal house where you have inside access to water, sanitation.
Yeah.
And more than half of the Ulaanbaatar city people carrying their water, and they all do not bring every day this water to wash, and just to survive.
I mean, in the Gare district, absolutely, and people will choose what form of accommodation they wish, and if it continues to be a Gare, great, but we need to ensure that Gare has improved pit latrines as a minimum.
People in Gare area in Ulaanbaatar city, they die about having replaced the Gares with normal housing, at least warm, and then inside have access to water. And unfortunately, this extension of infrastructure works so slow because everybody thinks the infrastructure is free. When the understanding is free, nobody is extending it. So that's the circle. Do you recall any good example of, say, in similar situation in Latin America, wherever people in this no access area created together something that made their life much better?
Well, we did in a number of the countries. In fact, we've worked on sanitation and really again looked at community-driven sanitation, because when the people themselves want it and they start demanding it, it's the same as healthcare.
Yes.
Once we get them aware that there's a little powder that you can put in children's drink that helps them get rid of diarrhea, most parents will do that. They don't want their children to be sick. And so it's the same with sanitation. If we can show them why good sanitation is important and they start demanding that. And so in a number of the countries, and including in Belize, where I worked just prior to coming here, we introduced with the indigenous population improved pit latrines. We also worked on, for the first time in my life, we did pig pens, which we built, again because of the contribution that animals make through their feces to not just chronic malnutrition, but to parasite infestation in children. And that again robs the children of the nutritions they need. So we started building pig pens to help resolve that issue. And we saw quite a dramatic increase in terms of the hygiene practices that they were using, as well as a downturn in terms of the disease and the diarrheal disease. I mean, here in Mongolia, it's an odd blessing that you have a very cold winter. And that does contribute to the bacteria dying.
Well, that's one of few things, but the important things to thank our cold winter. And also it purifies the air.
Indeed.
And I think destroys all bacteria. And I wish those people who is not working also, those people who is not doing their job, public officers also, to be a little bit frozen on. Anyway, Millennium Development Goal.
Yes.
That goal of Mongolia addresses these issues too. How do you see these Millennium Development Goals being implemented in this country?
Yeah, of all the Millennium Development Goals, I mean, some of them will be met, I believe, with a nice and with a focus on equity, I believe, and a good push. A little bit of a review of how the budget's assigned. I think we'll see that certainly the under 5 mortality and maternal mortality will come down to the level that's been established in the goals. Certainly the environmental goals, the poverty goals, the nutrition goal, and sanitation will not be met in this country. And I think that gives us a challenge. Obviously, the goals go to 2015, and the world doesn't stop then. For Mongolia, what we really need to do now is have a good roadmap and a good plan. Look, the economy is taking off. Perhaps, we've had various challenges and demands on the budget in the past. Now there's a clearer path to economic growth. We know that economic growth alone will never address poverty. We need to make very clear policies that are pro-poor And we need to make sure that we look at the way our budgets that have been developed the same way for the last decade or so. We need to get rid of that thinking and start, looking at equity and how we can make the budget work better for the populations.
So in terms of budget, how consistent is our government budget in this Millennium Challenge?
Yeah, I think the government has given a very focused attention to the Millennium Development Goals, to be honest, except probably in sanitation, which is the one that obviously I feel very strongly about. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge that they've had, you had a fiscal crisis that affected their budget capacity, and there are lots of challenges. There are, your health system functions, but it's quite fragile, and it will need to have a good plan for how we get rid of the dilapidated buildings, etc., and how we move forward on those areas. And I think for each of the goals now, and for all the challenges that to children's rights here, we need to have a good plan, and that'll help things stay on track, I believe, better.
You talked about the health system, and probably the level of rewarding or salary for those who is working in the health system. What do you think about that?
Yeah, obviously one of the areas that needs to be addressed by the government over time is looking at the remuneration that doctors and nurses get, the kinds of incentive packages that you have for those who are willing to go to the rural areas and work out there and work in some of the harder circumstances that we have. And you need to look at how the specialists rewarded. So if you expect someone, as we do, to do an additional 6 years of study to become a paediatrician or to become a obstetrician, then you also need to ensure that there's a return for that investment, because it is a long investment in terms of study and time. And I think all of those areas in terms of human resource management are on the agenda for the Ministry of Health. But again, it's, they have actually quite a good health strategy and strategic plan. What we need to do is implement it. What we need to do is make sure we give it life.
There are so many plans, good intentions in this country. Every year, every government announces every year for certain things, and when we hear very little about what exactly happened afterwards, unfortunately. Of course, there are a lot of things to do in this country, developing country, poor, but I don't want we to be poor in our mind. Okay. Well, you have been living in Ulaanbaatar city for the last 3 years, and certainly you are a part of us who is suffering from this smoke. What would you take on that?
Yeah, obviously the smoke and the impact that the pollution has on vulnerable populations, it's a major concern, and it's one that is being addressed but deserves the attention that it's getting, because you cannot sustain the levels of pollution and the numbers of cars, etc., here in the city without taking some very strategic steps to make sure that gets managed. And obviously, I'm a mother myself and have children here, and the levels of pollution are extremely concerning.
Your family is here?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You have 4 daughters?
I have 3 daughters and a son.
A son, okay. Do they live here, or?
The 2 older children, my stepchildren, live in the States, and the younger children are here, yes.
Okay, so what do they study?
They study at the international school.
Is the school okay?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Very good.
Do they give food at lunch?
Well, we send food to the
Okay,
children.
so it is not within this coverage area. Well, so what you would tell Mongolian mothers to grow their children now, say infant children, what is the best thing they have to pay attention? I mean, I know there is a difference of living standard, conditions, etc. So what is the number one things?
Oh, the number one, I had a 15 shoot into my mind as you asked that question. I think the number one is to, I would pay attention to early childhood development, which is that period between what we call 0, when the baby's born, but you should also be looking at what the mother does before the baby's born, to 5. And that in that period there are a couple of, we talk about the absolutely crucial first 2 years for nutrition. That's when the brain's forming. And if you get the nutrition right in those first 2 years, you will never do the damage in the following years that can be done in the first two.
Do you talk about
breastfeeding for the first 6 months, exclusively, wherever you can for the first 6 months. Exclusively. Solid commitment to breastfeeding for the first 6 months, and then look at that period. When you get to 6 months, then introduce complementary feeding. Sometimes what we see is that mothers wait, because they're still breastfeeding. Start introducing other foods there, and try as much as you can here to access vegetables and introduce vegetables to the children, because again, that first 2 years is the moment to get that formula right. I say the first 5 for early childhood development because if a lot of studies have shown if you make an investment in the child's stimulation and education in that period, then you will have a child who's more likely to stay in school, less likely to go into violence, less likely to drop out of school, more likely to go on to higher education. So it's, again, a crucial period in terms of education. What can fathers do? Fathers absolutely need to be engaged with their children, and if a father reads to their children every night...
Wow, okay. Let Mongolian fathers do it.
Yes, read. You don't have to read a long chapter book, but read to your children every night, or as often as you can during the week. Then we see a dramatic difference, particularly for boys, in their capacity to learn and the degree to which they stay in school. So it's like a magic pill, but we don't know, so we're not doing it. And then I would also say for that 0 to 5, get them into preschool, into early childhood education if it's available. If it's not, start demanding it, because that's where they're going to pick up some of the other skills that are essential, that will get them ready for when they move to school. It's also the period, you know, just watching the cars here in Mongolia, which is always interesting. The number of parents who have the children on their lap in the front seat. And I am absolutely convinced that they have no idea the degree to which they are endangering their baby's life. They must be in the back seat. No child should be in the front seat of the car until they're 12.
And there should be a special seat, and the police
if not,
should demand.
They should at least be in the back seat with a seat belt.
Yes.
We're seeing the number of children in car accidents increase, and the number of children killed
in Mongolia,
here in UB, increase, and it's quite a dramatic increase. So, you know, to all the parents, please put the children in the back seat. If you're going to sit them on your lap, sit in the back seat, because once that car brakes, you go forward, that baby goes forward, not only with their own momentum, but the momentum of whoever's holding them. So you add the force of the parent to them, and I've seen the impact that can have on children, and it is almost a death sentence for children. So that would be another area that I'd say.
Yeah, all right. That's probably our parents would know, but that would be a very good point for them to recall again what you said. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for the job what you're doing in Mongolia, and hope tonight our conversation have certain impact on somebody.
Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be able to work here, very honoured to be able to work for the women and children and families, and so I thank you and Mongolia for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rana.